Teacher ridicules Filipino boy who says his father works at the Pentagon. Then his father walks into the room. Don't miss a second of this story that will leave you surprised by its ending, and join us on this journey. Now tell me in the comments where you're watching this story from. Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to watch more stories like this and leave your like. Now let's get to the story. Michael adjusted his hearing aid discreetly while watching the music teacher walk between the rows of desks, distributing sheet music for the youth orchestra audition. At 14, he had developed an extraordinary ability to hide his hearing aid under his carefully combed brown hair. Not that it mattered for his music. Michael could hear enough with the help of technology, but it mattered to avoid the stares, the uncomfortable questions, and especially the prejudice disguised as concern. St. Francis Academy was known for its excellence in arts education. Each year, the best students from the music department had the opportunity to participate in the prestigious Spring Youth Orchestra, a gateway to national conservatories. Michael had dreamed of this since he first laid hands on a violin at the age of 6. "Remember, this is just the preliminary audition," announced Professor Richard, a middle-aged man with graying hair and the rigid posture of a conductor. "Those selected will have a final audition with Maestro Thompson himself, conductor of the City Orchestra. This is not a game. It's the beginning of a professional career for the truly talented." Michael felt his stomach churn. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk, translating the sheet music into rhythms that only he could feel. It was his way of studying, of internalizing the music before even playing. Since he was young, Michael had learned to feel the vibrations, to read music not just as notes on a staff, but as a visual and tactile language. "Michael Oliveira," called the teacher, stopping in front of his desk. "I see you're eager to begin." "Yes, Professor," Michael replied, looking up. Professor Richard placed the sheet music on his desk. It was a challenging piece by Vivaldi, with passages that required absolute precision. "This is a complex piece, requires a keen ear," the professor commented with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Are you sure you're prepared?" Michael noticed the deliberate pause, the slight movement of the professor's gaze toward the side of his head where the hearing aid was partially visible. It wasn't the first time he had noticed that kind of hesitation when someone discovered his condition. "I'm prepared, Professor," he answered with a confidence he didn't completely feel. But the professor had already moved on, distributing the last pieces of sheet music. Arthur, seated at the desk next to him, leaned toward Michael. "He always chooses the hardest pieces for those who don't stand a chance," he whispered. "They say, last year, a girl actually cried after her audition." Michael pretended not to hear, focusing on the sheet music in front of him. It was true that Professor Richard had a reputation for being rigorous, even cruel in his evaluations. But Michael was determined not to let that intimidate him. During the rest of the class, students had time to study the piece individually. Michael closed his eyes for a moment, visualizing his fingers sliding over the violin strings, feeling the bow dance to the exact rhythm of each measure. This was how he studied, first in his mind, then on the instrument. When the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Michael carefully put away the sheet music in his folder. While the other students left, chatting animatedly, he remained for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Can I use the practice room after classes?" he asked Professor Richard, who was organizing his own notes. The professor looked at him with an expression that Michael couldn't fully decipher. "Of course, the rooms are available until 6. The professor replied, adjusting his glasses. "But don't delude yourself, Michael. The orchestra requires absolute precision. A musician who can't hear perfectly..." He left the sentence hanging, but the meaning was crystal clear. "I can hear well enough, Professor," Michael responded, keeping his voice firm. "And what I don't hear, I feel." Professor Richard gave a polite smile, but his eyes revealed skepticism. "The auditions are next week. Good luck." Michael left the room with the familiar feeling of needing to prove his worth. In the hallway, he found his best friend, Lucy, waiting for him with her flute case. "So, which piece did you get?" she asked excitedly. "Vivaldi Winter," he replied, showing her the sheet music. Lucy's eyes widened. "Wow, that's advanced. He really doesn't make it easy for you, does he?" Michael shrugged, trying to appear unconcerned. "Shall we practice together after school?" he suggested, changing the subject. "Of course," Lucy replied with a smile. "My piece is much simpler, but I can help you time your performance." As they walked toward the cafeteria, Michael thought about how he would have just 1 week to master one of the most challenging pieces in the classical violin repertoire. Part of him wanted to give up right there, spare himself the humiliation he anticipated. But there was something stronger pushing him forward, a determination that came not only from his love of music, but from the need to prove, especially to himself, that his limitations would not define his potential. At that moment, he decided that it didn't matter what Professor Richard or anyone else thought. He would make that audition shine, even if it meant practicing until his fingers hurt and his mind knew every note of that score as if it were part of himself. The school auditorium was an imposing space, with high ceilings and acoustics designed for absolute clarity of every note. On the morning of the audition, it was occupied by only 3 people: Professor Richard, Professor Helen from Music Theory, and Principal Castro. They formed the panel that would select the finalists for the audition with Maestro Thompson. Michael waited his turn in the hallway, holding his violin as if it were an extension of his own body. He had arrived far too early, the result of a nearly sleepless night. Beside him, other candidates tuned instruments, reviewed sheet music, or simply stared into space, trapped in their own nervousness. "Number 17, Michael Oliveira," called the secretary, consulting her list. Michael took a deep breath and entered the auditorium. The space, normally welcoming during concerts, seemed intimidating at that moment. The light streaming through the tall windows created a natural spotlight on the center of the stage, where a solitary stool waited. "Good morning, Michael," greeted Principal Castro with an encouraging smile. "You may begin when you're ready." Michael adjusted the violin on his shoulder, quickly checked the tuning, and positioned himself. For a brief moment, his eyes met those of Professor Richard, who watched him with a neutral expression, pen in hand, ready to note every error, every hesitation. Closing his eyes, Michael allowed himself to feel the silence of the auditorium. It was a ritual he had developed over the years, this moment of connection with the space before filling it with his music. When he reopened his eyes, he no longer saw the panel or the empty auditorium. He saw only the music, the notes floating before him like a road he needed to travel. The first movement of the bow across the strings produced a pure, crystalline sound that seemed to dance in the air. Vivaldi's Winter came to life under his fingers, the fast and precise notes describing icy storms and cutting winds. Michael felt the vibrations of the violin against his chin, allowing his entire body to become an instrument of listening. He was in the middle of a particularly difficult passage when it happened. A note escaped slightly out of tune, almost imperceptible to most, but enough for Professor Richard to raise his eyebrows and make a note. Michael felt the error like a small electric shock, but he didn't allow it to break his concentration. He continued, regaining the rhythm, immersing himself even more deeply in the piece. When the final note finally dissipated in the air, Michael realized he was slightly out of breath. He lowered the violin and waited. "Thank you, Michael," said Professor Helen with a gentle smile. "Your interpretation was interesting." Professor Richard consulted his notes before speaking. "There were some intonation problems in the third measure of the second sequence," he commented, adjusting his glasses. "And the tempo was slightly irregular in the transition to the allegro." Michael nodded, accepting the criticisms. He knew that his execution hadn't been perfect, but he also knew that he had captured the essence of the piece, its stormy and melancholic soul. "You prepared this piece in just 1 week?" asked Principal Castro, seeming genuinely impressed. "Yes, sir," Michael replied. "Well, "I appreciate your dedication," said Professor Richard, closing his folder of notes. "The results will be announced tomorrow. You may go." Michael made a small bow, as was traditional after performances, and walked out of the auditorium. In the hallway, he found Lucy anxiously waiting. "How was it?" she asked, her eyes shining with expectation. "I'm not sure," Michael answered honestly. "I played the best I could, but Professor Richard pointed out some errors." Lucy squeezed his arm in a gesture of solidarity. "He always points out errors, even in perfect performances. It's his nature." The two walked out of the main building toward the courtyard. The day was sunny, contrasting with the tense atmosphere of the auditions. "What do we do now?" asked Lucy, trying to distract her friend. "Wait, I guess," Michael replied, carefully putting his violin back in its case. "There's not much else we can do." The next day, a small crowd gathered around the bulletin board in the main hallway. Michael tried not to show anxiety as he approached, with Lucy at his side, offering moral support. The list of 10 finalists was posted on school letterhead. Michael ran his finger down the names, his heart accelerating with each line. Lucy squeezed his hand when she found her name in 6th position. Michael continued down the list to the end. His name wasn't there. "There must be some mistake," Lucy murmured, checking again. "You played beautifully, everyone said so." Michael felt a knot form in his throat, but he forced a smile. "It's okay. There were many talented candidates." As they moved away from the bulletin board, a group of students passed by, animatedly discussing the results. "I heard Professor Richard commented that it would be impossible for someone with a hearing disability to keep up with the orchestra's rhythm," one of them said, without noticing Michael's presence. "He said it would be unfair to the other musicians." Michael stopped abruptly, as if he had been slapped. Lucy held his arm tightly. "Don't listen to that. It's just rumors," she whispered. But the damage was already done. It wasn't the first time his condition had been used as justification to exclude him, but this time it hurt, especially because music was everything to him. That afternoon, Michael found Professor Richard in the teacher's lounge, organizing sheet music. "Professor, may I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, keeping his voice firm despite the contained emotion. Professor Richard looked up, seeming slightly surprised. "Of course, Michael. I imagine it's about the results." "Yes, sir. I'd like to know specifically why I wasn't selected. Was it my performance or because of my hearing?" The professor placed the sheet music on the table and crossed his arms. "Michael, you're a talented student. I won't deny that. But the orchestra is a complex organism that requires constant communication between musicians. A musician needs to hear his colleagues, adjust instantaneously. With your limitation, that would be impossible. But I can hear with the hearing aid, Professor. And I've developed other ways to feel the music, to synchronize." "Michael," the professor interrupted, his tone now softer, almost paternal. "I'm trying to spare you from a greater disappointment. Maestro Thompson would never accept someone with your condition in the orchestra. I'm doing this for your own good." Michael felt his face burn. It wasn't anger he felt, but a deep disappointment. Not for the result itself, but for the certainty that he hadn't been judged for his talent, for his dedication, but for a limited perception about his capabilities. "I understand," he finally replied. "Thank you for your honesty." As he walked away, he heard the professor add, "There are other paths in music, Michael, perhaps composition or music theory, areas where your condition wouldn't be an obstacle." Michael didn't respond. He left the teacher's lounge feeling strangely calm, as if something inside him had solidified. What Professor Richard didn't understand was that, for Michael, music had never been just about hearing. It was about feeling, visualizing, internalizing each note until it became part of his own body. And no one, not even Professor Richard or Maestro Thompson, could take that away from him. The apartment was quiet when Michael arrived. He dropped his backpack on the couch and went straight to his room, carefully placing the violin case on the bed. He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to explain what had happened. He just wanted to be alone with his disappointment. He sat on the edge of the bed and removed his hearing aids, immersing himself in his own world of silence. It was a ritual he performed in moments of greatest frustration, this return to the silence that had accompanied him during the first years of life, before the hearing aids, before the speech therapy. Michael had been born with moderate bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. It wasn't profound deafness. With hearing aids, he could hear voices, music, the sounds of the world, albeit differently. Without the aids, the world transformed into a silent pantomime, where only the most intense vibrations reached his perception. It was in this silence that he closed his eyes and began to mentally play the Vivaldi piece, visualizing each movement, each finger position on the strings. It was his form of meditation, of escape, of healing. A vibration in the floorboards brought him back to reality. He opened his eyes and saw his mother, Anna, standing at the door with a concerned expression. She knocked lightly on the doorframe, their code to let him know she was there, a way of respecting his space while he navigated without his hearing aids. Michael signaled for her to come in and put his hearing aids back on. "How was the audition?" she asked, sitting beside him on the bed. Anna, a 40-year-old woman with the same wavy brown hair as her son, worked as a translator and always came home early on Wednesdays. "I wasn't selected," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. Anna carefully observed her son's face. She knew every nuance of his expressions, every subtle sign that indicated when he was trying to hide something that hurt him. "Was that all?" she asked gently. Michael hesitated. He didn't want to worry her, didn't want to turn this into an incident like so many others they had faced over the years, but he also couldn't lie to her. "The professor said someone like me couldn't play in an orchestra," he finally answered. "He said it would be impossible to keep up with the other musicians." Anna's face hardened for a moment, that familiar expression that Michael knew well, the lioness mother ready to defend her cub. But it soon softened into a sad smile. "He's wrong, you know that, right?" Michael shrugged, fixing his gaze on his own hands. "Maybe he's right. Maybe I'm deluding myself." Anna took her son's hands in hers, forcing him to look at her. "Michael, remember what your father always said?" The mention of his father made a knot form in Michael's throat. Robert had died when Michael was only 10, the victim of a car accident. It was he who had encouraged Michael to play the violin, who had never allowed his hearing condition to be treated as an obstacle. "Limitations are just invitations to find new paths," Michael recited, feeling a tightness in his chest at the memory. "Exactly," Anna confirmed, squeezing his hands. "Your father was the most stubborn and creative person I've ever known. And you take after him in that respect." Michael smiled slightly, remembering how his father adapted everything for him, from children's games to the first music lessons. Robert had been an amateur violinist and a physics teacher, a combination that made him especially skilled at understanding and explaining the physical aspects of sound. "You know what he would do in this situation?" Anna continued. "Probably invent some crazy device to prove the professor wrong," Michael replied, with a more genuine smile now. "Probably," Anna agreed, laughing softly. "But more importantly, he wouldn't give up." She got up and went to the bookshelf, retrieving a dusty photo album. She sat down again and opened it on her lap, flipping through until she found what she was looking for. "Look at this." The photograph showed Robert, younger, playing the violin in a small chamber ensemble. It was marked as Winter Festival 2004. "Your father told me he was almost rejected from this group because he had a professor who thought he didn't take music seriously enough. He said that a physicist playing the violin was just a dilettante," Anna explained. "Do you know what he did?" Michael shook his head, completely absorbed in the story. "He entered under a pseudonym in a competition where he knew this professor would be a judge. He won second place. When he revealed who he was, the professor had to eat his words." Michael looked at the photograph, noticing the gleam of challenge in his father's eyes, so similar to his own. "What I'm saying, son, is that sometimes we need to show people they're wrong about us, not with words, but with actions. Anna closed the album and set it aside. Your father would be so proud of you, Michael. Not for what you can or cannot do, but for the person you are, for never giving up. Michael felt his eyes water. Talking about his father always brought a mixture of comfort and pain. But how can I prove to Professor Richard that he's wrong if I didn't even get a chance to play for Maestro Thompson? Anna stood up, a determined expression on her face. We'll find a way. Your father wouldn't be the only stubborn one in this family. That night, after dinner, Michael returned to his room and took the violin from its case. Not to practice Vivaldi, but to play an old melody that his father had composed for him when they discovered his hearing condition. It was called The Sound of Silence, a contradiction that had always made him smile. As he played, he felt connected to his father, as if he could hear his advice, his encouragement. With each note, determination grew inside him. It was no longer just about joining the orchestra. It was about proving to himself and to the world that music knew no barriers, that there were many ways to hear, to feel, to create. When he finished playing, Michael made a decision. He didn't know exactly how, but he would find a way to show Professor Richard and Maestro Thompson that being different didn't mean being less capable. And more importantly, he would show himself that his father's legacy, this unshakable belief in the power of perseverance, continued to live in him. The Municipal Cultural Center was a 40-minute bus ride from Michael's house. On Saturday mornings, the place was usually relatively quiet, filled only with a few art students, elderly people attending literature workshops, and occasional musicians using the free rehearsal rooms. Michael had decided that if he couldn't join the youth orchestra, he would at least continue practicing and improving his skills. Anna had suggested that he take advantage of the cultural center's facilities, where he could play without disturbing the neighbors, and perhaps meet other musicians. That morning, as he walked through the corridors looking for an available room, Michael couldn't get the conversation he'd had with his mother out of his head. The story of his father confronting a professor's prejudice continued to resonate, like a persistent melody. He found a small room with a piano at the back and some folding chairs against the wall. It was perfect, isolated enough that he could practice without interruptions. He unpacked his violin and began the ritual of tuning, adjusting each string with meticulous precision. He was about to start playing when he heard a light knock on the door. As he turned, he saw a distinguished-looking gentleman with well-groomed white hair and lively eyes behind round glasses. He wore a simple dress shirt and dark pants and carried a folder of sheet music. "Forgive me for the interruption," the man said with a gentle smile. "I was passing by the corridor and heard you tuning. Violin?" "Yes, sir," Michael replied, slightly surprised by the approach. "Fascinating instrument," the gentleman commented, coming closer. "I've practiced piano for over 50 years, and it still enchants me how a violin can sound so close to the human voice." Michael nodded, not knowing exactly how to respond. The man emanated an aura of knowledge that slightly intimidated him. "Please don't let me interrupt you," the gentleman continued. "I was just curious about what you were going to play. I'm always looking for inspiration." "I was just practicing some scales," Michael explained, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Then maybe some Bach pieces." The gentleman's eyes lit up. "Bach, excellent choice. Do you mind if I listen a bit? I promise not to disturb." There was something in the man's gentle and enthusiastic manner that made Michael feel at ease. He nodded and positioned the violin, beginning with Partita No. 2 in D minor, a piece he knew by heart, and that always calmed him. As he played, he occasionally glanced at his spectator, who had sat down on one of the folding chairs and was listening with his eyes closed, completely absorbed. His presence, instead of intimidating, began to inspire Michael, who gave himself completely to the music, forgetting his recent disappointment, Professor Richard, everything except the notes flowing from his instrument. When he finally finished the movement, the gentleman opened his eyes and applauded enthusiastically. "Extraordinary! Your interpretation has a unique quality. a deep understanding of the emotional structure of the piece. Michael felt his face warm with the unexpected compliment. "Thank you, Mr. Forgive my lack of manners," the man replied, extending his hand. "Charles Thompson. And you are?" Michael felt the blood freeze in his veins. Charles Thompson. Maestro Thompson. The man who should have judged him in the final orchestra audition, the one for which he hadn't been selected. For a moment, he was paralyzed, not knowing what to say. Michael Oliveira," he finally replied, shaking the extended hand. Maestro Thompson studied his face for a moment, as if trying to remember something. "Michael Oliveira, the name seems familiar. Do you by chance study at St. Francis Academy?" Michael nodded, feeling his heart accelerate. "Yes, I'm in the 10th grade." "Ah, I see," the maestro replied, a flash of recognition in his gaze. "Their music department is excellent. I'm working with them on the selection for the youth orchestra. Did you apply?" The question hit Michael like a stab. Part of him wanted to lie, avoid the awkward explanation, but something in the maestro's genuinely interested expression made him opt for honesty. "Yes, I participated in the preliminary auditions, but I wasn't selected for the final phase." Maestro Thompson frowned, looking confused. "Really? That surprises me, considering what I just heard. Who conducted the preliminary auditions?" "Professor Richard Mendez, along with Professor Helen and Principal Castro." "Richard, of course," the maestro murmured, more to himself than to Michael. Then, as if making a sudden decision, he sat down again. "Michael, do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" Michael hesitated, wondering if the maestro had noticed his hearing aids. "No, sir." "Why do you think you weren't selected?" The question, asked with genuine curiosity and without judgment, caught Michael by surprise. For a moment he thought of giving an evasive answer, talking about the fierce competition or his own inexperience. But something in Maestro Thompson's attentive gaze made him opt for the truth again. "Professor Richard told me that due to my hearing condition, it would be impossible for me to keep up with an orchestra," he replied, discreetly indicating his hearing aids. "He thought it would be unfair to the other musicians." Maestro Thompson's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, understanding, and finally something that seemed like contained indignation. "I see," he said finally, his tone now more formal. "And how long have you been playing the violin, Michael?" "Since I was 6, sir." "And your hearing condition, has it been present since birth?" "Yes, sir. I have moderate bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. With the hearing aids, I can hear well enough for most activities." Maestro Thompson nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "And how do you synchronize when you play in an ensemble? Have you participated in any musical groups before?" "Yes, in the school choir and in a small chamber group last year," Michael explained, surprised by the direction the conversation was taking. "I've developed techniques to keep myself in time. I observe the movements of other musicians a lot. I feel the vibrations through the floor and the instrument itself. My mother also installed lights in our house that pulse with the rhythm when we practice together." Maestro Thompson listened with growing interest, his eyes narrowing slightly as if solving a mental puzzle. "Fascinating, truly fascinating," he murmured. Then, as if making a sudden decision, he opened his folder of sheet music. "Michael, do you know this piece?" He extended sheet music for Vivaldi's Spring, part of the Four Seasons. "Yes, sir. It's one of my favorites. Would you like to play it for me? Just the first movement." Michael hesitated briefly, surprised by the request, but nodded and positioned the violin. As he played, he observed Maestro Thompson closing his eyes, completely absorbed in the music. There was something liberating about playing for someone who didn't know about his previous rejection, who was listening to him without prejudice. When he finished, the maestro opened his eyes slowly. "Exceptional," he said simply. "Simply exceptional." He remained silent for a few moments, as if considering something important. "Michael, are you free next Thursday afternoon?" "Yes, sir. After classes. There's a small benefit concert at the Municipal Theatre. One of the violinists suffered an injury, and we need a replacement for a specific piece. It would be a single performance, no future commitment. Would you like to participate? Michael's eyes widened, unable to hide the shock. Me? But you barely know me. The maestro smiled. Sometimes we know someone better from 5 minutes of their music than from 5 years of their words. What do you say? I'd love to, but Michael hesitated, feeling he needed to be completely honest. You understand that I have hearing loss, right? I understand perfectly, the maestro replied calmly. And after what I just heard, I also understand that it doesn't prevent you from being an excellent musician, unless of course you believe it does. Michael felt something untie inside him, a tension he didn't even know he was carrying. No, sir, it doesn't. Then it's decided, concluded Maestro Thompson, rising. Thursday, rehearsal at 4. Here's my card with the details. As the maestro headed for the door, he turned one last time. Oh, and Michael, bring your mother if possible. I'd like to talk to her about those lights you use. I have some ideas that might be useful for the orchestra. When the maestro left, Michael remained motionless for several minutes, his heart beating so hard he could feel the pulse in his ears. He had just received an invitation from Maestro Thompson himself to play in a real concert. A man who, according to Professor Richard, would never accept someone with his condition. At that moment, Michael understood that his journey was just beginning. And was he nervous? Absolutely. But he was also more determined than ever to show the world, and especially himself, what he was capable of. The news of Maestro Thompson's invitation fell like a bomb on Michael and Anna's quiet routine. That night, sitting at the dinner table, mother and son could barely contain their excitement. Are you sure he knew about your hearing condition? Anna asked for the third time, still incredulous. Absolutely, Michael replied, poking at the pasta on his plate. I spoke directly about it, and he didn't seem bothered at all. In fact, he seemed more interested. Anna shook her head amazed, and he even wants to know about our light system. Who would have thought? The light system was one of the many adaptations that Robert had created years ago. It consisted of small LED lights that pulsed to the rhythm of the music, allowing Michael to keep time even when he couldn't perfectly distinguish the subtler sounds. Anna had continued perfecting the system after her husband's death, a way to keep his memory and inventive spirit alive. We need to prepare, Anna said, suddenly entering organization mode. Which piece are you going to play? Do you need anything new for the concert? A haircut, perhaps? Does your suit still fit? Michael laughed at the sudden explosion of maternal concerns. Mom, breathe. We don't even know exactly which piece I'll be playing yet. And yes, my suit still fits. Anna took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. Sorry, it's just that this is, well, it's amazing, isn't it? It is, Michael agreed, finally allowing himself to smile openly. It really is. On Thursday, Michael and Anna arrived at the Municipal Theatre 30 minutes early. The elegant building with its classic architecture was intimidating, with its majestic arches and marble staircases. Inside, the space was even more impressive, with its high ceiling adorned by an immense chandelier and rows of red velvet seats. Backstage, professional musicians tuned instruments, adjusted sheet music, and conversed in low tones. Michael felt simultaneously enthusiastic and completely out of place. He clutched his violin case to his chest as if it were a shield. Michael! The familiar voice of Maestro Thompson sounded a few meters away. He was coming toward him with a warm smile, wearing an elegant black suit. I'm glad you came, and this must be your mother. Ana Oliveira, she introduced herself, extending her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Maestro, and thank you for inviting Michael. The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Oliveira, the Maestro replied with a small bow. Your son has remarkable talent. But come, let me introduce you to the rest of the ensemble. Michael was introduced to 6 other musicians, 2 violinists, a cellist, a bassist, a flutist, and a pianist. They all greeted him with polite smiles, though some seemed slightly surprised by his youth. "Michael will be replacing Eduardo in the opening piece," Maestro Thompson explained. "Vivaldi's Spring." One of the violinists, a middle-aged woman with a friendly expression, smiled at Michael. "Welcome. I'm Isabella. If you need anything, just ask." "Thank you," Michael replied, feeling a bit more at ease. Maestro Thompson turned to Anna. "Mrs. Oliveira, Michael mentioned something about a light system that you use to practice at home. Could you tell me more about it?" While Anna explained the system created by Robert, Michael unpacked his violin and began tuning it. He was concentrated on this task when he noticed a familiar figure entering the backstage area, Professor Richard. His blood froze in his veins. Of course, the professor would be there. As the head of the school's music department, it was natural that he would attend important musical events in the city. Michael observed the exact moment when the professor spotted him, recognition and confusion crossing his face in rapid succession. The professor walked directly toward the group, his gaze fixed on Michael. "Maestro Thompson," he greeted, completely ignoring Michael and Anna. "I didn't know you would be here tonight." "Richard, what a pleasant surprise," the maestro replied, apparently oblivious to the sudden tension. "I came to substitute for Maestro Silveira, who is unwell, and I brought a young talent for our opening. I believe you already know Michael Oliveira." Professor Richard finally directed his gaze at Michael, an expression of barely disguised perplexity on his face. "Yes, Michael is my student," he replied slowly. "I didn't know he would be participating today. It was a last-minute invitation," Maestro Thompson explained cheerfully. "I heard him play by chance at the Cultural Center and was impressed. A rare talent." Professor Richard's eyes oscillated between Michael and Maestro Thompson. "He has certain limitations," he said finally, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. Maestro Thompson raised his eyebrows. "Limitations? What limitations would those be?" Michael felt his heart accelerate. Anna placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Well," continued Professor Richard, clearly uncomfortable, "Michael has a hearing condition that, unfortunately, prevents him from adequately following an orchestra. That's why I didn't select him for the final auditions." A tense silence fell over the small group. Michael kept his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to face the professor's gaze. "Interesting," Maestro Thompson replied after a moment, his tone neutral. "Because I heard him play Bach with perfect rhythmic precision, and Vivaldi, whose Winter, if I'm not mistaken, was the piece you selected for his audition, right, Michael?" Michael nodded, surprised that the maestro knew that detail. "I'm sure it was a beautiful interpretation for a solo," insisted Professor Richard, now visibly agitated. "But an orchestra is different. Synchronization is crucial." "Indeed," agreed Maestro Thompson. "That's precisely why I'm excited to see how Michael will do today. By the way, his mother just explained to me about a fascinating system of lights they developed to aid in synchronization. An extremely creative solution." Professor Richard shot a quick glance at Anna, who looked at him with a politely neutral expression, though her eyes shone with a silent challenge. "Well, it will certainly be interesting," he concluded, backing away slightly. "I need to greet some acquaintances." "Excuse me?" When the professor moved away, Michael finally allowed himself to breathe. Maestro Thompson placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about that now," he said softly. "Just focus on the music. The rest will resolve itself." The rehearsal went surprisingly well. Michael found his place among the other musicians with ease, and Vivaldi's Spring flowed through the ensemble like a perfectly orchestrated conversation. When they finished, there was a moment of appreciative silence before the musicians burst into praise. "You have impressive bow control," commented Isabella, the violinist who had initially welcomed him. "How long have you been studying?" "Since I was 6, Michael replied, blushing from the sincere compliment. "Well, it seems you were born for this," she added with a warm smile. Maestro Thompson clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. Excellent, everyone. A short break, and then we'll rehearse the transition from the first to the second piece. Michael, you can rest a bit, since you'll only be participating in the opening. Michael found his mother seated in the front row of the empty theatre. Her eyes shone with pride. "You are incredible," she whispered when he sat down beside her. "Thank you," he replied, feeling a wave of contentment. "It feels like I'm dreaming." "Your father would be so proud," said Anna, squeezing his hand. Suddenly, a thought occurred to Michael. "Mom, do you think Dad would have been disappointed that I wasn't initially selected for the orchestra?" Anna looked at her son seriously. "Michael, your father never measured value by achievements. He would be proud of your perseverance, your courage to keep trying even when people said you couldn't do it. That's how you honor his memory, by not giving up." Michael nodded, absorbing her words. Deep down, he knew she was right. His father had always valued effort more than results. As the concert hour approached, the theatre began to fill. The audience consisted mainly of supporters of the charitable cause, a foundation that promoted music education for children in underprivileged communities. Backstage, Michael adjusted his dark suit and checked his violin one last time. Nervousness had finally caught up with him, making his fingers tremble slightly. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Nervous?" asked Maestro Thompson, approaching. "A little," Michael admitted. "Good," the maestro replied with a calm smile. "Nervousness keeps us alert, as long as we don't let it control us." He looked beyond Michael, toward the curtain separating the backstage from the audience. "You know, Michael, there are people out there who have never seen a violinist with hearing aids before. Some might think it's impossible. Others will be curious. But in the end, what matters is the music you produce, not how you hear it." Michael nodded, feeling a new wave of determination. He wasn't just there to play. He was there to show the world, and especially Professor Richard, that different didn't mean incapable. "I'm ready," he said, lifting his chin. The maestro smiled. "Then let's go. We have an audience waiting." The lights went out in the main theatre. A single light illuminated the stage. And then Michael walked to the center, feeling dozens of eyes on him, including, somewhere in that audience, those of Professor Richard. Instead of intimidating him, this thought only strengthened his resolve. It was time to let the music speak for itself. The moment Michael's bow touched the violin strings, everything around him seemed to disappear. There was no more audience, no Professor Richard, not even the weight of expectations. There was only the music, flowing through him like a crystalline river. Vivaldi's Spring came to life under his fingers, its joyful and vibrant notes filling the theatre with the promise of new beginnings. The ensemble followed him perfectly, creating a sound tapestry as rich and colorful as the season that had inspired it. Michael felt the vibrations of the instrument against his body, saw the subtle movement of the other musicians in his peripheral vision, and let the music guide him like a sixth sense that had always been dormant within him. It was as if every cell in his body knew exactly when and how to move. When the piece ended, there was a moment of reverent silence before the audience erupted in applause. Michael looked at Maestro Thompson, who watched him with a satisfied and proud smile. The small ensemble stood up, and Michael bowed along with the other musicians. It was only when he raised his head again that he noticed something peculiar. Some people in the audience weren't just applauding, but also waving their hands in the air. He realized with surprise that they were using the American Sign Language version of applause. His heart expanded with an emotion he couldn't name. Backstage, after the performance, Michael was approached by several members of the audience. Among them, a little girl of about 10, accompanied by her mother. The girl also wore hearing aids, more visible than Michael's. "You were amazing," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with admiration. "I want to learn violin too." Michael crouched down to be at eye level with her. "What's your name?" "Julia," she replied shyly. "Well, Julia, if you really want to, there's nothing that can stop you," he said, feeling a strange role reversal, as if suddenly he were the mentor, not the insecure boy he had always felt himself to be. The girl's mother smiled gratefully. "Thank you. She's been asking for lessons for months, but I was hesitant. I thought it would be too difficult." "It can be challenging," Michael admitted, "but not impossible. Far from it." As he spoke with Julia and her mother, Michael saw from the corner of his eye Professor Richard standing a few meters away, observing the scene with an expression he couldn't completely decipher. It wasn't exactly regret, but there was something there, a kind of confusion, as if he were reconsidering something fundamental. After saying goodbye to Julia, Michael was approached by Maestro Thompson and Anna, both radiant with pride. "You were absolutely magnificent," said the maestro. "We need to talk about your musical future, young man." Anna hugged her son, her eyes shining with contained tears. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. It was at this moment that Professor Richard finally approached. He seemed uncomfortable, as if he didn't know exactly what to say. "Michael," he began, hesitant, "your performance was surprising." It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from Professor Richard, it was practically an ovation. "Thank you, Professor," Michael replied politely. "It seems I underestimated your capabilities," the professor continued, the words clearly difficult for him. "I apologize for that." Michael felt a strange mixture of emotions, satisfaction, relief, but also an unexpected compassion for the man before him, who was clearly struggling against his own entrenched conceptions. "We all make errors in judgment, Professor," he replied, surprising himself with the maturity of his words. Maestro Thompson, who was observing the interaction with interest, intervened. "Richard, I'm considering including Michael in the next season of the youth orchestra. What do you think?" Professor Richard seemed momentarily disconcerted, but then nodded slowly. "I think he has certainly proven his worth." "Excellent!" exclaimed the maestro. "Michael, what do you say? Would you be interested?" Michael could hardly believe what he was hearing. A direct invitation to the youth orchestra. No more auditions, no more tests to pass. Yes, of course," he replied, unable to contain his excitement. "Great. We'll talk about the details next week," said the maestro. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to thank the other musicians." When the maestro moved away, Professor Richard remained there, as if wanting to say something more. "Michael," he said finally, "I'd like to talk more about this at school on Monday. Perhaps we can reconsider some things in the music department." And with that, he walked away, leaving Michael and Anna looking at each other in surprise and cautious hope. The rest of the evening passed like a dream. Michael received compliments from strangers, exchanged contacts with the other musicians, and was even approached by a reporter from the local newspaper who wanted to do a story about the young violinist who defied limitations. When they finally arrived home, exhausted but exultant, Michael found a message on his cell phone. It was from Lucy. "Saw a video of your solo on Instagram. You rocked it. Everyone at school is talking about it. Can't wait to hear all the details on Monday." "I'm so proud of you." Michael smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for having a friend like her who had always believed in him, even when he himself doubted. Before going to sleep, he removed his hearing aids and sat on the edge of the bed, reflecting on the extraordinary day he had just experienced. In the silence that only he knew, he revisited each moment. The initial nervousness, the music flowing through him, the applause, the look of amazement on Professor Richard's face, the admiration in little Julia's eyes. There was something deeply poetic about how silence and music had intertwined in his life, each giving meaning and depth to the other. Music had given him a voice. Silence had taught him to hear beyond sounds. He thought of his father, wondering if somehow he knew what had happened today. Limitations are just invitations to find new paths. The words had never seemed so true. With this comforting thought, Michael fell asleep, dreaming of orchestras and silent applause and doors opening to worlds of possibilities he had never before imagined possible. Monday arrived with a strange mixture of normality and novelty. Michael walked through the hallways of St. Francis Academy as he always had, but something had changed. The looks he received now were different. There was curiosity, yes, but also a new kind of respect. Some students who normally barely noticed his existence waved or smiled as they passed him. Lucy met him before the first class, practically jumping with excitement. "You're practically a celebrity now," she exclaimed, showing him her cell phone with the video of Michael's performance that had been shared dozens of times on social media. "Even the principal commented about you at the teachers' meeting this morning." Michael smiled, still trying to process this new reality. "It's strange. Good, but strange." "Well, better get used to it," Lucy replied with a mischievous smile. "Oh, and Professor Richard is looking for you. He asked you to stop by his office during the break." The mention of Professor Richard brought back a slight nervousness. Despite the conciliatory words at the end of the concert, Michael didn't know exactly what to expect from this meeting. The morning classes passed in a blur of occasional congratulations and normal schoolwork. When the break bell rang, Michael took a deep breath and headed to Professor Richard's office in the music department. The door was ajar. He knocked lightly and heard the familiar voice of the professor inviting him to enter. Professor Richard was seated at his desk, surrounded by organized piles of sheet music and music theory books. He seemed different somehow, less rigid perhaps, or simply more human. "Ah, Michael, thank you for coming," he said, indicating the chair in front of his desk. "Please, sit down." Michael obeyed, waiting in silence for what would come next. "First, I'd like to reiterate my apologies for how I conducted the orchestra selection," the professor began, surprising Michael with his immediate frankness. "I made an error in judgment based on prejudices I didn't even realize I had." Michael nodded, not knowing exactly how to respond. "Your performance on Saturday was a lesson for me," the professor continued. "An important lesson about not imposing limits on others based on my own limitations of perspective." He adjusted his glasses, a gesture that Michael now realized was a sign of nervousness, not of superiority, as he had always interpreted. "Maestro Thompson and I talked at length after the concert. He told me about visual support systems for musicians with different hearing abilities, about how orchestras around the world have adapted to be more inclusive." The professor paused, as if organizing his thoughts. "This made me think about how many other talents might be going unnoticed or being actively discouraged by our lack of imagination." Michael felt something change within him. The authoritative and intimidating figure that Professor Richard had always represented began to transform into something more human, more vulnerable. "Professor, I understand, really," said Michael, surprising himself. "Sometimes it's hard to imagine realities different from the ones we know." Professor Richard looked at him with a new expression of respect. "You're a very generous young man, Michael. More than I deserve, perhaps." He cleared his throat, as if returning to more practical matters. "Well, the reason I called you here is to discuss two things. First, Maestro Thompson has confirmed his intention to include you in the youth orchestra for the next season. The official information will be sent this week." Michael couldn't contain a smile. "And second," the professor continued, "I'd like to propose a change in the school's music department. I'm thinking of creating a mentoring program between students of different levels, focusing especially on the inclusion of students with different abilities. I'd like you to be one of the main mentors." Michael blinked, surprised. "Me? But I'm just a sophomore." "A student who has a unique and valuable perspective to share," the professor replied. "Besides, your performance has inspired several other students. Did you know that 3 students with different needs have already approached me today, asking about music lessons?" Michael felt a wave of pride and responsibility. He had never thought of himself as a role model, as someone who could open paths for others. "I would be honored, Professor," he replied after a moment of reflection, "but I have no experience in teaching." "You have something more valuable than experience," said Professor Richard, leaning slightly forward. "You have authenticity, and that can't be taught." The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of emotions for Michael. The news of his new role in the music department spread quickly, and several classmates approached him with questions and congratulations. Lucy was especially excited. "This is amazing," she exclaimed during lunch. "You'll be able to change the way the school deals with inclusion." "That's really important, Michael." Michael nodded, still absorbing the weight of the responsibility he had just accepted. "I hope I can make a difference," he said, absent-mindedly poking at his food. "It's strange to think that a few weeks ago I was trying to hide my hearing aids, and now they're part of what makes you special," Lucy completed with a gentle smile. "Not just different, but special." In the weeks that followed, Michael divided his time between rehearsals with the youth orchestra, which began immediately after the official invitation, and the development of the mentoring program at school. Professor Richard, to his surprise, proved to be an enthusiastic collaborator, actively seeking ways to adapt the music curriculum for different needs. Michael's first major project as a mentor was a small, inclusive concert organized by the school. Students with various conditions, from physical disabilities to neurodivergence, were encouraged to participate, each contributing in their own way. For some, this meant playing adapted instruments, for others, expressing music through paintings or dance. On the night of the concert, Michael watched from backstage as Julia, the little girl he had met after his performance at the Municipal Theatre, prepared to play a simple melody on the violin. She had become his first official student, and seeing her nervousness mixed with excitement brought back vivid memories of his own journey. "I'm scared," Julia confessed, holding the small violin with trembling hands. Michael crouched down to be at eye level with her. "You know what my dad always told me before performances?" he asked softly. Julia shook her head, curious. "He would say, 'The music is already inside you. All you need to do is let it out.'" Michael smiled at the memory. "And you know what? He was right." Julia nodded, her small face lighting up with a new kind of courage. "The music is already inside me," she repeated like a mantra. "Exactly," Michael confirmed. "Now go out there and let it out." When Julia took the stage and played her simple but perfectly executed piece, Michael felt his eyes water. It wasn't just pride in his progress as a teacher, but the understanding of how a cycle had been completed. He, who had once been discouraged, was now opening doors for others like him. Anna, who was watching from the audience, found him after the concert with eyes bright with emotion. "Your father would be so proud," she said, hugging him tightly, "not just of your talent, but of the man you're becoming." At that moment, Michael understood that his journey had been transformed into something greater than himself. What had begun as a personal struggle to prove his worth had become a mission to change perceptions and create spaces where everyone could be seen and heard, each in their own way. Spring transformed into summer, and summer gave way to autumn. Michael's life had found a new rhythm, faster, more rewarding, and infinitely richer in possibilities than he had ever imagined. The rehearsals with the youth orchestra 3 times a week became the highlight of his routine. Maestro Thompson had fulfilled his promise to adapt the environment for Michael's needs, installing subtle rhythmic lights that pulsed with the tempo of the music, visible only to him on his music stand. But to everyone's surprise, other musicians began to comment on how the visual aid helped them too, especially during complex tempo changes. At school, the mentoring program was flourishing. What had started with just Michael and 3 students had grown to include 15 mentors and over 30 mentees, spanning various art forms: music, dance, visual arts, and even creative writing. Professor Richard had become its most vocal advocate, presenting the program at educational conferences and inviting other schools to implement similar initiatives. Michael's reputation had spread beyond the walls of St. Francis Academy. He had been featured in the local newspaper, and a short documentary about the inclusive arts program was in production. More importantly, he had become a reference point for parents of children with hearing impairments who wanted to know if music could be part of their children's lives. One particularly cool autumn afternoon, Michael was in the school's music room, finishing a mentoring session with a group of elementary students. As the children packed up their instruments, chattering excitedly about the upcoming winter concert, Michael noticed a familiar figure leaning against the doorframe, Maestro Thompson. "Don't mind me," the maestro said with a warm smile when Michael noticed him. "I'm just observing a master at work." Michael blushed at the compliment, saying goodbye to the last of his students before approaching the maestro. "What brings you here, maestro?" "Our rehearsal isn't until tomorrow." "Actually, I came to discuss something with you and Professor Richard," he replied, a mysterious glint in his eye. "Is he around?" "He should be in his office," Michael said, curiosity piqued. "Shall we go find him?" They found Professor Richard exactly where Michael had predicted, surrounded by scores and sipping tea from a mug emblazoned with musical notes, a gift from the mentoring program students. "Charles?" the professor exclaimed, standing to greet Maestro Thompson. "This is a pleasant surprise." "Richard," the maestro nodded warmly, "I've come with a proposition that I think will interest both you and young Michael here." The three sat down, an air of anticipation hanging in the room. "The City Orchestra is planning a special concert series for next spring," Maestro Thompson began, "dedicated to breaking barriers in classical music. We want to showcase musicians who challenge conventional expectations of age, background, physical ability, and I'd like to feature Michael as one of our soloists." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The City Orchestra wasn't just any professional ensemble. It was the premier orchestra in the region, with internationally acclaimed musicians. "Me?" he whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "But I'm just a student." Maestro Thompson shook his head firmly. "You're much more than just a student, Michael. You're an example of what we're trying to communicate with this concert series, that music transcends all barriers when given the chance." Professor Richard leaned forward, clearly excited by the idea. "It's a tremendous opportunity, Michael, and well-deserved." Maestro Thompson wasn't finished. "There's more. We'd also like to feature the mentoring program as part of the concert series. A pre-concert showcase of your students and perhaps a collaborative piece with some of the City Orchestra musicians." Michael and Professor Richard exchanged stunned looks. "That would be incredible," the professor said. "It would give our students an experience they'd never forget. And it would show the world what inclusive arts education can achieve," added Maestro Thompson. "This isn't charity, gentlemen. This is about expanding the boundaries of what we consider possible in classical music education and performance." As they discussed the details, Michael felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He remembered sitting in this very office months ago, devastated by his rejection from the youth orchestra. How dramatically things had changed since that day. The door that had seemed so firmly closed had not only opened, but had led to pathways he couldn't have imagined. Later that evening, as Michael shared the news with Anna over dinner, she watched him with eyes shining with unshed tears. "Your father used to say that the universe has a way of making things right if you just keep showing up," she said softly. "I think he was onto something." Michael nodded, feeling the truth of those words deep in his bones. "Do you think he somehow knows?" he asked, a question he hadn't voiced since he was much younger. "About everything that's happening?" Anna reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "I think that the best parts of him live on in you, Michael. In your perseverance, your creativity, your kindness. So in that way, yes, he knows. He's part of every note you play." That night, Michael lay awake long after he should have been asleep, his mind buzzing with thoughts about the upcoming concert series. It wasn't nerves that kept him awake, but a profound sense of purpose. He was no longer playing just for himself, or even to prove something to doubters like Professor Richard had once been. He was playing to open doors, for Julia, for the students in the mentoring program, for children whose parents had been told impossible too many times. He was playing to change the narrative about what it means to be different, to have limitations that aren't really limitations at all, but rather invitations to innovation. As he finally drifted towards sleep, Michael remembered something his father had often said when facing challenges in his physics research. The most beautiful solutions are often found at the edges of impossible problems. Michael smiled in the darkness. His father had been right about that too. The Municipal Theatre was filled to capacity on the opening night of the Breaking Barriers concert series. The audience was a diverse mix of classical music aficionados, students, families of the performers, and members of the deaf and hard of hearing community, drawn by the pre-concert publicity that had highlighted Michael's story. Backstage was a hive of organized chaos. Professional musicians in formal attire mingled with students from the mentoring program, all united by the common language of music and the excitement of the evening ahead. Michael stood in a quiet corner, reviewing the sheet music for his solo piece, Bach's Chaconne from Partita No. 2 in D minor, a challenging work that represented both technical mastery and emotional depth. It was the same piece he had played for Maestro Thompson during their first meeting at the Cultural Center, coming full circle in a way that seemed almost poetic. "Nervous?" asked a familiar voice. Michael looked up to see Professor Richard, impeccably dressed in a tuxedo, his usual stern expression replaced by one of genuine warmth. "Terrified," Michael admitted with a small laugh. "But in a good way." The professor nodded, understanding. Fear and excitement are close cousins. Both quicken the pulse, sharpen the senses. The difference is merely in how we choose to name them. Michael smiled, appreciating the professor's philosophical take. "Thank you, Professor. Not just for tonight, but for everything. For changing your mind about what was possible." Professor Richard shook his head slightly. "You did that, Michael. I merely had the good sense to see what was right in front of me. Eventually." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "You've taught me more than I could ever teach you." Before Michael could respond, Maestro Thompson approached, a clipboard in hand. 10 minutes, gentlemen," he announced. "Michael, you'll be on after the orchestra's opening piece. Are the lights set up as we discussed?" Michael nodded. The theatre had installed a discrete light system, similar to the one Anna had perfected at home, ensuring that Michael could maintain perfect synchronization during the orchestral portions of the program. "Everything's ready, Maestro." "Excellent." The Maestro placed a reassuring hand on Michael's shoulder. "Your family is in the front row. And I believe I saw your young student Julia practically bouncing with excitement." Michael grinned, imagining the scene. Julia had made remarkable progress in the months since she began lessons, her initial timidity replaced by an infectious enthusiasm for the violin. "By the way," added Maestro Thompson almost casually, "there's a representative from Juilliard in the audience tonight." No pressure, of course. With that bombshell dropped, he moved on to check on the other soloists, leaving Michael momentarily speechless. Juilliard, the most prestigious music school in the country, perhaps in the world. It had always seemed like an impossible dream, not even worth considering. Yet here he was, about to perform with a professional orchestra, with a Juilliard representative watching. As the call for performers to take their places came, Michael found himself standing next to Isabella, the violinist who had welcomed him so warmly at his first rehearsal months ago. "Remember," she whispered, "we're all just vessels for the music. Let it flow through you and everything else will follow." Michael nodded gratefully for the wisdom. Then the lights dimmed, and it was time. The concert began with the orchestra performing Beethoven's Egmont Overture, a piece chosen deliberately for its themes of heroism and triumph over adversity. From his position in the wings, Michael watched the audience, noticing for the first time the many people wearing hearing aids openly, some with cochlear implants, others with sign language interpreters beside them. They had come for the music, yes, but also for something more. Representation, validation, the sight of someone like them on that prestigious stage. The responsibility felt weighty, but also right, a mantle he was ready to carry. When the overture concluded to enthusiastic applause, Michael took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The spotlight found him, and for a moment he was blinded by its brightness. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out Anna in the front row, her face a picture of pride and emotion. Beside her sat Julia and her mother, both beaming up at him. And then, as he had done so many times before, Michael raised his violin to his shoulder, positioned his bow, and began to play. The first notes of Bach's chaconne filled the theater, rich and resonant. Michael closed his eyes, allowing himself to become one with the music, feeling each vibration travel through the violin into his body. The piece was technically demanding, with its complex chord structures and intricate melodic variations, but Michael had lived with it for so long that it felt like reciting a beloved poem from memory. As he played, Michael thought about his journey, from the boy who hid his hearing aids beneath his hair to the young man who stood before a full theater, his difference not a source of shame, but of strength. He thought about his father, whose belief in finding new paths had guided him even in absence. He thought about Professor Richard, whose change of heart represented the very transformation this concert sought to inspire in others. When the final notes of the chaconne resonated through the theater, there was a moment of profound silence, that magical, fleeting interval where the audience collectively holds its breath, still entranced by the music that has just ended. Then came the applause, thunderous and accompanied by the visual spectacle of hundreds of hands waving in the air, the silent applause of the deaf community, a gesture that had become a tradition at all of Michael's performances. The rest of the concert passed in a blur of music and emotion. The mentoring program students performed their showcase piece, a specially arranged medley that incorporated elements of classical, jazz, and world music, reflecting the diverse backgrounds of the participants. Julia, playing with the confidence of a musician twice her age, had a small solo that drew appreciative murmurs from the audience. The finale brought everyone together. The city orchestra, the soloists, and selected students from the mentoring program in a powerful rendition of Copland's Fanfare for the Common Man, arranged to include parts for musicians of all skill levels. Standing among these performers, feeling the collective energy of so many individuals united in a common purpose, Michael experienced a sense of belonging more profound than any he had ever known. At the reception following the concert, Michael was surrounded by well-wishers, fellow musicians, audience members, journalists, and representatives from music schools, including the Juilliard Scout, who expressed serious interest in having Michael audition the following year. But among all these encounters, one stood out. A man in his early 30s approached Michael, a young boy of about 7 beside him. The boy wore hearing aids similar to Michael's own. "Mr. Oliveira," the man said, his voice charged with emotion, "I wanted to thank you, not just for your beautiful music tonight, but for what you represent. My son, Daniel, was diagnosed with hearing loss last year. He loved music before, but afterward, he thought it was over for him. Then we read about you in the newspaper." The man placed his hands on his son's shoulders. "Daniel has started piano lessons. His teacher says he has a natural gift. And it's because of you, because you showed him it was possible." Michael crouched down to speak directly to the boy. "Music never leaves us, Daniel," he said softly. "Sometimes we just need to find new ways to hear it." The boy smiled shyly, then surprised Michael by pulling a folded program from his pocket, along with a pen. "Can I have your autograph?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight tonal differences common to those learning to speak with hearing aids. "I want to remember tonight when I have my first concert, As Michael signed the program, he felt the full circle of his journey complete itself. From the boy who had been told what he couldn't do, to the young man showing others what they could become. It was a transformation he could never have imagined that day in Professor Richard's classroom, struggling with Vivaldi's Winter. Later that night, after the crowds had dispersed and the theatre had emptied, Michael found himself alone on the stage, looking out at the sea of empty seats. In a few hours, it would all be dismantled. The special lights, the adapted acoustic panels, the sign language interpreter's station. But something would remain, invisible but indelible. The sense that a barrier had been broken, not just for him, but for many others who would follow. As he stood there in the dimmed theatre, Michael thought he could almost feel his father's presence beside him, nodding in approval. Limitations are just invitations to find new paths. The words that had once been a comfort now felt like a mission statement, a philosophy to guide not just his music, but his life. Michael picked up his violin one last time that night, playing softly in the empty theatre, the notes rising into the darkness like prayers. It wasn't Bach or Vivaldi or any composed piece, but a simple, heartfelt melody of his own creation, the sound of gratitude, of journey, of arrival. As the final note faded away, a question formed in his mind, one he imagined asking all those who might hear his story. What barriers do you believe are unbreakable? What possibilities lie just beyond your perception? The silence that followed wasn't empty, but full of promise, of stories yet to be written, of music yet to be heard. My friends, we've come to the end of the story. Did you like it? What lesson can you bring to life from this story? Leave it here in the comments. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and watch this video that's playing on your screen. This story will impact you. See you next time.